Good evening, everyone, and thank everybody for tuning in. And I am Siva Haru Ka Anu, welcoming you all to the launch of a brand new program that we are so happy to feature here. I know many of you who've tuned in here to this particular channel on the radio have generally heard my program, Chapters, Verses, and Volumes Literary Review Program. However, I am the producer of a new program that I'm so happy to announce to you, and that is the African History Notebook. I want to welcome you all to a program that we are so happy to get off the ground. And the African History Notebook is a program that tells the story of African history from the point of view of the researcher. And with this particular program, we've reached out to a number of historians who we've asked to consider hosting the African History Notebook to tell us African history from their point of view, from their vantage point, from their own research. And so what we've done is we reached out to a great historian and somebody who I really consider a people's historian, and asked this gentleman if he would consider being our first host on the African History Notebook, and that he would consider hosting our show for 3 to 4 months and provide for you on a week-to-week basis information pertaining to African history from the vantage point of his research and his notes. And the person that I am talking about is none other than the historian Dr. Clyde Ahmad Winters. And about Dr. Winters, Winters reminds me of a person who, he reminds me of the great late historian J.A. Rogers, and some of you may be familiar with the great J.A. Rogers, who's published so many works on African history from the, I believe maybe especially throughout the 1940s and right on into the early 70s, World's Great Men of Color, Sex and Race, a 3-volume set, Nature Knows No Color Line, From Superman to Man, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. He has done prolific work. And Dr. Clyde Ahmad Winters is someone who is very much akin to a person like the great J.A. Rogers, in the sense that Dr. Winters has written almost on every conceivable area that African people have migrated to and have carried diffused civilization to in the ancient world. You know, today we're using the internet, of course, and if you were to type in a major search engine, black people in ancient China, black people in ancient America, black people in ancient Europe, almost black people on the moon, the name Dr. Clyde Ahmad Winters will come up. He is such a prolific writer. And Dr. Winters is the author of numerous articles and books on education, ancient history, anthropology, and archaeogenetics. And Dr. Winters' books include Teaching Ancient Afrocentric History, Atlantis in Mexico, and Afrocentrism, Myth or Reality. And his most recent book is Brain-Based Learning and Special Education. And he's also working on a book on archaeogenetics of ancient civilization. And so what he's doing for us, as I just mentioned, is that week to week, he is taking us on a journey of African history around the world. And I can only tell you that I am so absolutely proud and happy to be able to introduce to you a great historian. And what he wants to do, what he wants to do is to engage you, the listener, in a dialogue on this particular topic, so that it isn't a program where you are just simply listening to this great historian, but this is a program where you actually are encouraged to call in and to discuss with Dr. Winters' history. What he has to provide for us is this critical detail in this area. And listen, I'm falling over myself as I seek to give an introduction, to him. So what I'm going to do is bring him up on the line right now. Welcome, Dr. Winters.
Yeah, how you doing, Haruka? Thank you for inviting me to participate in the program.
Yeah.
And I'm very excited about it because I do want to share some of the research that I've done.
Yes.
You humbled me in comparing me to Mr. J. Rogers, because J. Rogers was one of my idols. And I can tell you that it's very important to think about J. Rogers and others, because it's these heroes who allow us to do the research we do today. It reminds me of the fact that when I grew up on 47th Street in Chicago, I was always struck by the fact that we had a lot of street scholars. And these street scholars were always talking about African history, ancient history. And we had Hammurabi, and Hammurabi was a guy who made a newspaper. And in his newspaper, he had all these wonderful stories about blacks in ancient times. We also had, I lived around the corner from a Moorist scientist temple, so many of the brothers back then could even speak Arabic, so I was fascinated with this field. And so when I decided that I wanted to be somebody, I decided that I wanted to be an historian, but not just any historian. I wanted to be a historian to really investigate our past. And what I'm going to do is this, is that for you listeners, what I'm trying to do is that every week I'm going to discuss a topic. And what I've done is that I have a number of videos on YouTube. So every week we'll discuss a different topic related to ancient history. And during this time, what you're going to do is you'll be able to see these videos. And when you look at these videos will give you an introduction to what we're going to talk about. I've set up a website at olmec98.net. Again, olmec98.net/historynotes3 HTM. At this website, it will direct you to many of the things. I'm going to kind of run over some of the things now. Tonight we're going to talk about the origin of blacks and one of the first civilizations in Africa. Next week, March 22nd, we're going to discuss the Asian Kushites. And in this show, I'm going to discuss how African people migrated out of Africa and began to develop civilizations in Europe. As part of this show, we're going to basically discuss some of the ancient people who founded civilization in Mesopotamia and Anatolia. On 329, we're going to discuss the original blacks who founded the civilization of Greece. On April 5th, we're going to discuss the ancient blacks who ruled China, because many people, they don't really know that at one time, civilization in China and civilizations in Southeast Asia were built by black people. So we're going to discuss the Shia civilization. On April 12th, we're going to begin a month-long discussion of blacks in ancient America. When you think about blacks in ancient America, you usually think about the Sabbath, or the great scholar Ivan Van Sertma's book that came before Columbus. But what we're going to do is that we're going to do something a little different. What we're going to do is that we're going to discuss those black people who came to the Americas as early as 30,000 BC. And we're going to, on this first show, we're going to discuss these blacks, and we're going to, in a sense, discuss the first Americans. On April 19th, we're going to go into detail, discuss the Olmec civilization. The Olmecs, that's kind of my hobby, and in fact, these people I think I'm kindred to because of the fact that they spread so much civilization in the New World, and much of the civilization was later picked up by the Mayans and the Aztecs. On April 26th, we're going to discuss further blacks in ancient America. We're going to discuss the Negro Castamanes, and these are black people of Mexico who claim that they were never slaves. These black people, I believe, also became some of the earliest rulers in Mexico. Also on the show on April 26th, I'm inviting Dr. David Imhotep Jones. And Dr. Jones has written a very exciting book on ancient blacks in America, which I think you will find interesting. Okay, beginning in May, we're going to, in a sense, begin to discuss literacy in Africa. Europeans like to mention the fact that black people never had rights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss the origin of writing in Africa, and I'm going to begin with what's called a Thinite script. And the Thinite script is a writing system, a syllabic writing system that many of the later scripts used by African people, both syllabic writing and alphabetic scripts, used as their progenitor. And that'll be on May 3rd. On
Dr. Winters.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. But can I do this on your behalf? What I just posted in our chat is a schedule of the program. So if I can let the listeners know that you actually created a website as a companion to this program. And so that for those who are listening into the program, you can actually go to the website and you can get a week-by-week listing of what's coming up on the show. And what Dr. Winters has done is he has published a number of videos documenting his research on the web, particularly on YouTube. And so you'll be able to find a number of the videos that are companions to the topic. So I share that, Dr. Winters, so that you don't have to give folks all the detail of the schedule.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm gonna ask you what most folks want to know tonight. What's the topic tonight? What you gonna talk about?
Okay, what we're going to talk about tonight is the origin of blacks, our spread, and the rise of the first civilization in Africa. Okay, first of all, it's very important to remember that African Americans have been deeply interested in the study of the ancient world. And this has been very important because if you really look in the history of the intellectual history of African people, you're going to find that it was African people in the United States who first began to research about ancient blacks. Clyde Winters, in Miseducation of the Negro, observed the oppressor played up before the Negro, in his crimes and his shortcomings. Let him learn to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton. Lead the Negro to detest the man of African blood, to hate himself. In other words, we're constantly bombarded, even to this day, on radio and TV, with different shows and different programs that depict black people as wild people, black people as people are inhuman. Dr. Amos Wilson is a very important scholar because he was a clinical psychologist. And Brother Wilson, what he did is that he found, in a sense, that when black people or people don't know their history, what they do is that they create a false sense of reality because, see, although we're taught that history isn't important, history is very important because history gives you a grounding. They tell you that history has nothing to say to you, but history is very important. Amos Wilson, the falsification of African consciousness, Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy, believes that the African spirit and mind can only be healed through the advancement of African-centered historiography. He says, in a sense, apparently the rewriting, the distortion, and the stealing of our history must serve vital economic, political, and social functions for the Europeans, or else he would not bother and try so hard to keep our history away from us, and to distort it in our own mind. It's very important in a sense that we remember that knowing your history is also a way to ensure that you have a good psychological health. You need to know your history because of it knowing your history that you're able, in a sense, to know your place in history, your situation, and how you can, in a sense, perform those things necessary to be the man you are. In the beginning, there was blackness, there was darkness. Sure, people, in a sense, have heard this, but do they really understand it? In the beginning, there was a great black nation, and this great black nation was founded upon the idea that African people should be involved in their own history and their own movement. Many Afrocentric scholars, beginning with Du Bois and others, they began to research black history. And what they did is that they first began to tie black people into ancient history through the Bible. People like Cornish and others, what they did in a sense is that they were able to create a pedagogy. Cornish and Russ were able to create a pedagogy in which they situated African people in Egypt. And you know that this whole idea of African Americans being Egyptians is so terrifying to many Europeans. And it's terrifying to many Europeans because Egypt was the first Pan-African civilization. When I say Pan-African civilization, I mean that Egypt was a place where there were black people from various different groups, various different populations that came together to create what we call ancient Egypt. And the beauty of this whole thing is that many of these African people who belonged to Egypt migrated into West Africa and later were sold into slavery. This is very, very important because you don't understand. The European, he tries to pretend that Greek is his epitome of history, but the only problem with Greek history is that no Western Europeans are a part of Greek history. You see? In fact, the Greeks call themselves the middle group, and they call themselves the middle group because they were part black and part white. But African Americans, what gives us a uniqueness is that because of the fact that we came from the Wolof people, the Mandi people, the Igbo people, the Akan people, what it means in a sense that these people were part of ancient Egypt. Because they were part of ancient Egypt, that means that we're still carrying that knowledge, that creativity that our forebears created in Egypt. And this is why you see that over in America, the European, in a sense, he needs us because it's through us that they can find that science, that knowledge that came from Egypt that's in our genetic memories. And so you see, that's why Du Bois, J. Rogers, Pauline E. Hopkins, Dr. G.W. Williams, and Leo Hansberry. That's why these great men were writing about our history because they knew that we had a connection. And they wanted us to be able, in a sense, to regain that connection and know who we are. Man, as you know, was created in Africa. There are two theories about the origin of man. One theory about the origin of man is that it's called the multi-genetic theory. The multi-genetic theory, stated simply, means that different racial groups originated in different parts of the world. If you adhere to this idea, then you're going to say that European people originated in Europe, Chinese people originated in East Asia, and African people originated in Africa. But in reality, we only have, in a sense, this whole idea of a monogenetic origin. And a monogenetic origin means that mankind originated on the African continent. Because mankind originated on the African continent, the first men were African. And therefore, every other group descended from us. When we talk about, in a sense, early man...
Doctor, can I ask you one thing?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I won't interrupt you ever again on your show.
You can, I don't care.
All right. Okay, can you slow down?
Okay.
I know you're excited. I know you're excited. I just want to say to the listeners, I know that you're excited, and you have a lot to tell us. But if you could just slow down and just, hey, relax. We're in your living room, and just take us through it, know where to get to. I appreciate that.
Okay. Right. I'll do that. I hate to say it, but that's what my students always tell me when I'm teaching.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
Again, there's two theories about the origin of man, the multi-genetic theory and the monogenetic theory. And the monogenetic theory simply means that man originated in Africa and that all people are descended from Africans. Scientists believe there were two branches of hominids, and hominid is the anthropological or generic scientific term for mankind, are descendants from Australopithecus afarensis, who lived 2.8 million years ago. From Australopithecus, scientists believe that man evolved into various different hominids, or various different types of man. One of the earliest men was Homo habilis. And Homo habilis simply means handyman. In other words, Homo habilis was able to use tools, and he appeared about 1.8 million years ago. After Homo habilis, we have Homo erectus. Homo erectus means upright man. Homo erectus came around 500,000 years ago And he left Africa and settled in many parts of the world. In fact, scientists have found numerous skeletons of Homo erectus in Asia, in addition to Africa. And then finally, around 200,000 years ago, we see the origin of Homo sapien sapien. And Homo sapien sapien is called the wise human. And Homo sapien sapien is supposed to be our greatest ancestor. Okay. When you study genetics, it's very popular today that to claim that black people only left Africa 60,000 years ago. This is false because we know only recently they had an article in which they discussed the fact that as early as 100,000 years ago, African people had migrated from Africa to Crete. And from there, they probably went into Europe. One of the things that led to our knowledge of many of the African people that lived in Europe was because of the fact that for a long time there was the Ice Age. And this Ice Age made it almost impossible for wise man, or Homo sapiens sapiens, to really play an important role in the rise of civilization. But when you look at archaeology, when you look at the skeletons allow us to really gain an understanding of the multiple expansions of African people or black people. The first migrants to leave Africa were probably the people who lived in Australia. These Australians are believed to have left Africa around 60,000 years ago. When they left Africa, they crossed the Horn of Africa, and at that time there was a landmass that connected East Africa to India, and from there they were able, in a sense, to walk across South Asia and Southeast Asia, and then the Suland, which is off the Southeast Asian shore, all the way to Australia. So the first people to leave Africa were the Australians. The second group to leave Africa were the Neanderthals. Although when you look in all these books, they always have Neanderthal man looking as though he was some wild European, short, stubby, bearded. That's not how Neanderthal looked. When you really go back to seeing some of the earliest reconstructions of Neanderthal man, you'll find that Neanderthal man was probably also a black African. But as we know, the Neanderthal man had different DNA. But if you go to my website and look at the films, you'll be able to see that Neanderthal man from the earliest reconstructions looked African. After Neanderthal man, another group of people left. And in fact, many geneticists and archaeologists agree that the most important group to influence the rise of civilization, especially in Europe, were people we call today the Khoisan. The Khoisan people, they live presently in Tanzania and South Africa, but the Khoisan people really represent the type of human that we call Cro-Magnon man. Again, Europeans have tried to steal Cro-Magnon man and say that Cro-Magnon man was the first European. Cro-Magnon man was not the first European, at least a white European. Cro-Magnon man was, in a sense, a Khoisan people. The Cro-Magnon people, they crossed the Iberian, they crossed the Straits of Gibraltar around 45,000 years ago. These people began the Aurignacian culture, and they expanded civilization all the way from Iberia, Portugal, and Spain, across Europe into Eastern Europe. And it was these Khoisan people who we also know as Grimaldi. And if you know the Grimaldi people, built a fantastic culture. What they only put in the books are pictures of the Grimaldis, and you see the women with the large breasts, the big buttocks and all that. but they also created a fantastic civilization, a fantastic art. They were very creative. And these Khoisan people were able, in a sense, to create civilization. We know that they were Khoisan people because of the fact that the Grimaldi, who ruled Europe for an extended period of time, also created art in South Africa. And this art in South Africa corresponds almost completely to the early art formed by the Grimaldi people. After the Grimaldi people, the next group to leave Africa were the Pygmy people. And I think the Pygmy people are the most important and most interesting group in our history. I know that many of you have probably read about the ancient Anu people of Mesopotamia. Well, the Anu people of Mesopotamia were the Pygmy people. And these Pygmy people, what they did is that they built a fantastic civilization. And this civilization led to them, some people will say they even created airplanes and things like that. They also had writing. We know in a sense that many people have tried to imply that the Anu were some people who came from outer space. No, the Anu were people who came from Africa. In fact, Petrie was able to discover that some of the first rulers of Egypt before Menes were the Anu people. And these Anu people, they ruled the world until the Great Flood, around 4000 BC or thereabouts. And as a result of the Great Flood, what happened is that these Pygmy people were left stranded on islands in the Pacific. They were left in South America. And as a result of the Great Flood, their civilization declined. But after the Pygmy people came our direct ancestors. And our direct ancestors are people that I call the Proto-Saharans. The Proto-Saharan people, they lived in the highlands of Middle Africa. In fact, I like to call the highlands, those high mountain areas or those mountainous areas in Middle Africa, I like to call it the fertile African crescent. And the reason I call this area the fertile African crescent is because of the fact that the highland areas or the mountains, they in a sense seem to form a crescent shape. And it was here that our ancestors, the Proto-Saharans, lived. These Proto-Saharans, when they left from the mountains after the flood, they began, in a sense, to occupy many parts of Africa. In fact, under the leadership of Menes, some of these Proto-Saharans even came into what we call Nubia and up the Nile and founded the ancient civilization of Egypt. Okay, right now we are going to take a break, and I'll come back and we'll discuss this further. Okay, welcome back. I'd like to kind of review what I talked about earlier. The first group of blacks to leave Africa were the Australians. They left Africa around 65,000 years ago. After the Australians, we see that the Khoisan people migrated across the Straits of Gibraltar into Iberia, and they expanded across Western Eurasia around 45,000 BC. 20,000 BC, we see the spread of the Twa, the Anu people, who we call Pygmy today, and these people expanded across the world. They settled on the islands in the Pacific. They settled in South America, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. And it's these people, in a sense, who had a fantastic civilization until the Great Flood. And then finally we come to the Proto-Saharans. The Proto-Saharans, they appeared around 4000 BC, and they began to expand. The Proto-Saharans created a civilization that I learned was called the Ma Confederation. The Ma Confederation included the ancestors of the Dravidians, the Mandi people of West Africa, and the Sumerians, in addition to other people. These people who lived in the mountains of the fertile African crescent, what they did is they practiced what's called an agro-pastoral civilization. An agro-pastoral civilization is a civilization in which the people practice agriculture, and they also, in a sense, raise cattle. The first animals that the Proto-Saharan's raised were sheep. And these sheep were used by the Proto-Saharans because they lived in a mountainous area where there wasn't too much water. Because there wasn't too much water, they needed, in a sense, to be able to have a ready supply of food that they could, in a sense, feed off that didn't really take or need water. And that's why the first domestic animals were sheep. These Proto-Saharans, what they did is that they began, in a sense, to recognize their descent from Ma. And they called Ma the Great Fish, and in fact, the Ma Confederation, which included the ancient Egyptians, the Elamites, the Dravidians, the Manding and Sumerians, and none of the great ancestor Ma, they worshiped a god they called Amun, Aman, or Amma. The Manding, in a sense, because of their descent from the fish god Ma, they call themselves Mainde or Mandi. Ma means mother, Inde means children. These people, in a sense, what they did is as the Amu civilization declined in Asia, what they did is they began to expand into places like Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and they began to build new cities, and in these new cities, they began to practice their civilization. I'm always asked by Europeans, why is it if African people had such a great civilization that you only see the outpourings of the civilization in places like ancient Egypt? And they say that the Olmec civilization has no relationship to African people. They say the Mesopotamian civilization has no relationship to African people because African people, they claim, failed to have any real civilization in Africa. What you have to understand is that in most African societies, these societies are traditional societies. Because they are traditional societies, what happens is that all knowledge in these societies comes through the training in the secret society. Okay, because of the fact that the knowledge you learn is knowledge that is only allowed to be discussed in the secret society, most African people cannot take that knowledge of architecture, that knowledge of the sciences, and really be able to use it to invigorate their native areas. They could only do that when they expanded to new areas like ancient America, or when they went to Mesopotamia, or even when they went to Egypt, because let's face it, when you look at the ziggurats of Samaria, when you look at the temples in Dravidian India, all you're looking at is a pyramid. The only difference is that these different architectural features have, in a sense, a place, a look that is somewhat different, and yet is based on that ancient creativity, that ancient way of seeing the world. And this is what you have to understand is that in many ways the secret society is a beautiful place in terms of knowing, but the secret society can also be a place in which people are not allowed to really practice and really be able to show their deep science. These are people, the Proto-Saharans, when they went to these various countries, what they did in a sense is that they tried to make sure that they invigorated the people. An interesting thing about these Proto-Saharans is that they like to refer to themselves as black people. Many people also argue about the fact, and they say, why is it that the ancient Egyptians call themselves that they were from Kemet? I mean, what does Kemet have to do with this whole idea? Why would people call themselves black? Then you find, in a sense, that the people in ancient Sumeria, they call themselves the blackhead. The Proto-Saharans that lived in ancient Egypt, ancient China, they call themselves Li men, the black men. And the people in Olmec America, they call themselves the She, which means black. And the reason that these people call themselves black is because they were part of their heritage, because they recognized in a sense that although the blackness of space is mysterious, although the blackness of space in a way is sometimes scary, they also recognize that the whole universe is black. And it's that rise of knowledge, in a sense, sparks of light that really invigorate the universe and that really allow us to see and know who we are. Okay, right now I'd like to open up for your questions, or I can continue talking. Is it okay right now for us to take the questions?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Dr. Winters, yes, it is. Our studio, our buttons get a little stuck here. But for those of you who are listening into the program, our host is Dr. Clyde Ahmad Winters, the great historian, who is, the topic this evening is on the African origins of humanity and the diffusion of African people around the world. And he's open for questions. So for those of you, if you have any questions you want to put in the chat, please write your questions in the chat, and I'll read them to him. Are you looking at the chat, Dr.?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so you can put them in the chat, and he'll respond to them. For those of you who are listening in by radio, by telephone, if you want to ask questions via the telephone, press the number 1 on your phone, and that will give me a indication that you're interested in asking a question, and I'll bring you on to the studio. And you can ask your questions. For those of you who want to call in to ask questions, the number to call is 347-633-9561. That's 347-633-9561. So I'll look for you all to call in, and those of you who want to write, you can write in. But yeah, can I start with a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You indicated in terms of the migration, one of the earliest groups of migrants were those of Australia.
Yeah.
Which I found to be real interesting. Because if I'm hearing you correctly, you're suggesting that those who are of Australia actually migrated before those that you indicated who are the Grimaldi, the Khoisan, and the Anu. And but what I'm interested in knowing is that the last three that I just mentioned, the Grimaldi, the Anu, that some also identify with the Twa, and the Grimaldi and the Khoisan, they were of a shorter stature. Am I right? And when we look at the stature that they were, like, when I'm saying shorter stature for the listeners, we're talking about 4.5 to 5 foot 5'3", and 4.5 feet to 5 feet 3 in height. The folks of Australia appear to have a different physical stature. Weren't they a bit taller?
Yeah, they could be a bit taller, but remember, many of the changes that occur among us can basically be the result of diet. Mm-hmm. You can have a change in diet, or just like if you look at African American people, and I like to use the word African American people for people who live in the United States, because many people here today are directly from the motherland. And so when I say Afro-American people, I'm talking about those people who grew up here. And if you remember, as a result of selective breeding, you find that that Afro-American people are much thicker, larger thighs. The women are somewhat more heavier than many of the people that you would find in the motherland. And much of that came from breeding and diet. And so the Australians, they in a sense could also be the result of diet. But again, if you really notice it and you look at some of the Australians, they vary in height. But we find that many of the earliest skeletal remains are people who are fairly short. So diet changes in living conditions.
Okay. So if I can ask you another question. So for the Australian population that migrated, you'll say, did you say about 65,000 BC?
About 60,000 BC.
Okay. So, I'm listening.
Oh, go ahead. They migrated about 60 to 65,000 BC, and one of the reasons that I feel and that they were some of the earliest is that they have many of the broad facial characteristics that are associated with some of the earliest hominids. And in fact, it's through this looking at the various facial features, and that you can tell in a sense people who may be of the much more ancient variety.
So now, were for the Australian population, you said 65,000 BC, right?
Right.
But you mentioned 200,000 BC.
Okay.
For the Homo Erectus, Homo sapien sapien. Mm-hmm. And my question there is now, the Homo sapiens sapien, this is considered to be our earliest direct ancestor.
Yes.
Now, did the Homo sapiens sapien, our earliest direct ancestor, did any of them migrate outside of Africa?
Okay, for a long time, people believed that they didn't migrate out of Africa except at one time, and that was 60,000 BC. But what happened is that they recently discovered a lot of artifacts on Crete that date to around, I think, 125,000 BC. That shows that there was a migration out of Africa. But it's very important to remember that we know that there were constant movements of people out of Africa and to other parts of the world because we have Homo Erectus skeletons found in East Asia. So this shows that there was a continuous migration of people out of Africa. But Europeans have a tendency to want to make history make history very simple. And how they make history very simple is they try to make you believe that people who are in a place today have always been there for thousands of years. For example, we know that most Europeans, there were no people that we call Europeans in Europe until maybe as late as 1000 BC. Everybody in Europe, if you look at the skeletal remains, were of African people. But in a sense, they make you believe that they have always been there. And this is the trick that is played on the minds of people throughout the world, is to make you believe in a sense that African people have not expanded, but they have migrated out. But again, this research that they've found relates to a migration out of Africa around 125,000 BC is fairly new. And because it's fairly new, there's going to take a lot more time to really research and clarify it, especially in terms of the tools that they use.
Well, then can you tell us something about the lifestyle of the, now, for those that were on Crete, you said now their migrations, apparently African migrations of the Homo sapiens sapien at about 60,000 BC. And when you do this then, tell us something about their lifestyle, some of the things that they did, and then will you also talk about some of the things that the Australians, the Australians did at 65,000 BC, and were there any similarities between them in terms of what they did?
Okay, well, basically, we know that they had pottery, and we know that they had boats, and this is very important to remember, is that both the Australians and the people who lived on Crete, they had boats, they made pottery, they made tools, and their lifestyle was basically to build villages based upon using local materials. But one of the things that it's important to understand is that I hope many people, were you able to see what happened in Japan?
The tsunami and the earthquake and the tsunami.
Right, and so what it is that most people who build ancient civilizations, they usually build them near the sea or near sources of water. And one of the reasons they do that is that we need water to survive, right? But if you look at that tsunami, it can let you see what happened to those ancient black civilizations. I can't really talk about Crete because the research there is fairly new. What I do know is that the Australians, they dominated much of coastal Southeast Asia and Australia. And in fact, there was in a sense, across the Sahul, where you could walk all the way from Southeast Asia to Australia. But what happened is that it seems to have appeared a great tsunami or something, and this tsunami, when it came, it just knocked off all links. And when people, in a sense, are disconnected from their past, what happens, in a sense, is that they may go back to what some people may call a primitive civilization, but it's not necessarily a primitive civilization. It's a civilization that allows people to maintain their way of life. If you really look at African history, you find that African people like to live in small villages. And one of the reasons that they like to live in small villages, I believe, is because of the fact that when you have these large expansive cities, you have a tendency not to be able to, I'm not going to say control the population, but you have a tendency where people have enough freedom to be able to do many things that may not be necessarily good for society. But when you have a small village, what happens is that the elders have more influence, and they're able to maintain relative stability within society. The Australian people, the thing about much of their civilization is that much of their civilization is under mud. Much of their civilization is deep under the various layers of the earth because of the fact that these various earth changes have taken place. And these earth changes appear, and when they appear, one group will rule, they decline, and another group rise. That's why we find, in a sense, that we have the Garoni people in Europe. Then once their civilization declined, we have the Anu people. The Anu people in Europe are very interesting because a friend of mine, Vamos Bator, he was a Hungarian guy, and we did a lot of research in terms of the Anu people in Europe. And what's interesting is that when you hear stories about the leprechauns or the wee people and the people who lived in these fantastic villages and cities of gold, or when you hear the story about Gruff and when they're trying to Billy goes Gruff and they're trying to cross the bridge into these beautiful cities. These beautiful cities were lived in Europe by these ancient Anu people. But cataclysms occurred, and when these cataclysms occurred, Europeans were able, in a sense, to come in and destroy those civilizations, and they pushed the Anu people further and further north, you see. And so we find, in a sense, that it's these natural catastrophes, these tsunamis, these earthquakes, that appear randomly. When they appear, they cause a decline in one civilization and the rise of another.